Professor, while we have you, we also wanted to talk to you about the Ukraine war, which out the case that Putin could expand the war beyond Ukraine, striking inside of Europe. You have also, Kyiv has been striking inside of Russia. You've had Russia escalating attacks directly on the city of Kyiv. So just give us a little bit of an update of where the war stands, and if you think that this is a realistic possibility that's being laid out here in the Wall Street Journal.
But the Russians are nevertheless making progress in Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine has turned the tide on the battlefield and is rolling the Russians back, or will someday roll the Russians back, is not a plausible argument. The Russians are winning on the ground, and you want to remember that they've already conquered 20%, roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, and they're not going to give that territory up. Ukraine is never going to recover that 20% that it's already lost. The only question is how much more territory will the Russians conquer? And they will conquer more territory. So that's the ground war. And the Russians are reaching the point where they're saying enough is enough. And they bombed Kyiv on Sunday night in ways that they have never bombed that city before. They really turned the dogs loose, as I like to say. And they're threatening to do even more. They've warned European countries to remove their diplomatic staffs from Kyiv because they are obviously intending to hit targets that might include those diplomatic installations. But the real worry is that the Russians will hit targets inside of Eastern Europe or even Western Europe. There are voices inside of Russia that say it's time to take off the gloves and to go after targets in Europe because the Europeans are assisting the Ukrainians in these attacks on Mother Russia. The argument, which is quite correct, is that there is no way that the Ukrainians could attack Russia, could attack deep into Russia with drones and missiles the way they're doing now without significant assistance from the West. And if that is the case, we, the Russians, have to attack into the West if they're going to be allowed to attack into Mother Russia. So it looks like there is a serious possibility that at some point in the future, the Russians will attack NATO countries, and that would be potentially disastrous.
Zelensky, in a new letter to President Trump and to Congress, saying that he urgently needs Patriot interceptors.
There's no question that we have used up so many Patriot missiles, so many THAAD missiles, Tomahawks, on and on in the war against Iran, that we're in a situation where there are great limits on the weaponry that we can provide to the Ukrainians. And of course, this includes Patriot missiles. And Patriots were their best defensive weapons. And they're out of Patriots. And therefore, they're wide open to attacks from Russia. And what Zelensky's trying to do is convince the Americans that they should send Patriots to Ukraine to help Ukraine fend off these Russian attacks. But the fact is that we don't have Patriots to give them. We've expended so many weapons in the war against Iran. So this means that Ukraine is wide open to attacks from Russian missiles and from Russian drones for the foreseeable future.
Let's say that Russia does go forward with a strike, direct strike on a NATO country. What do you think would happen then? You know, what does that look like? What actions do you believe that the U.S. would be likely to take in that scenario?
Launch limited conventional attacks against the West. And if that didn't convince the West to cease and desist from helping the Ukrainians to attack into Russia, deep into Russia, then what the Russians should do is think about using nuclear weapons. Not large numbers of nuclear weapons, but just a handful of nuclear weapons to send a very clear signal to the West that the Russians mean business. What the Russians feel they have to do here is establish deterrence. The Russians believe, and I think quite correctly, that the West thinks that they can help Ukraine attack Russia and there'll be no price to pay for the West. The West gets a free ride here. It just can help the Ukrainians punch away at Russia. There's no real deterrent in effect against the West. And the Russians believe they have to establish a deterrent. And they want to do that with conventional weapons, or they're talking about doing it with conventional weapons. But their argument is if that doesn't work, they'll use nuclear weapons.
Wow.
The Russian perspective here is basically that the West doesn't understand that they're dealing with a nuclear armed adversary, that we live in the nuclear world, and that when you begin to threaten the Russian homeland and you begin to kill Russians in large numbers, that you are creating a situation where the Russians are going to have an incentive to strike back, and to strike back in serious ways, and to try to convince the West that we live in a world where nuclear deterrence should obtain. You in the West may have forgotten about that, but we're going to remind you that we live in a world where nuclear weapons may be used, and we will use nuclear weapons if necessary to restore deterrence. So that's what's going on here, and it's a very dangerous situation because the West and Zelensky don't seem to care about Russian red lines.
Right.
The West and the Ukrainians seem to think that they can just pound away at the Russians and get away with it.
And if you look at the Iran situation, they were only able to establish deterrence by inflicting immense economic damage on the world. And by doing that, they were able to demand a ceasefire. You know, Russia can read the news just like anybody else and say, okay, we have to do something similar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by the way, just to go to back to the Iran case, when you look at the Iran case and you tie that into North Korea, you see that North Korea was smart to get nuclear weapons, and that Iran should have gotten nuclear weapons, because the Israelis and the Americans definitely would not be attacking Iran if it had nuclear weapons that could hit Israel. And the reason they're doing that is because they think they can get away with it. They can get a free ride because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And your point about the parallels between the Iranian case and the Russian case, I think, is right on the money. That's the lesson that the Russians have taken from what the Iranians have done.
Well, this-
And to make it stop, they're willing to go up the escalation ladder. And then, of course, the question, as we've been talking about, is whether or not they're willing to use nuclear weapons and break the nuclear taboo. So